Hi everybody and welcome to another one of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. And I'm going to take you from about 1,000 years BC right the way up to the present date with some of the strangest, weirdest and most peculiar things to do with death. We have a tendency to look at ghosts and spirits and all things weird, so what are the strangest ways that people have ever died? Well, I'm starting off with a man called Draco, who lived in Athens about 600-700 years BC. He was a lawmaker, a barrister, a solicitor of his time, and he went to a theatre and booked it just for his friends to show how appreciative he was for their friendship. So he stood at a table just before you go into the theatre, and one by one his friends came in, threw their cloaks onto his arm, and gave him a gift that he held in his other hand. So many people threw their cloaks at Draco that he smothered to death beneath them all. His friends by that time thought it was really funny, thought it was just a laugh, until they moved all of the cloaks to realise the guy had smothered beneath them. Now, in the early 5th century, before the Christians claimed the Messiah, a man called Charondas, he was another law type, and he issued a law throughout all of Sicily that if anybody brought weapons into the council hall, the assembly, he would be put to death. And then one day, he arrived at the assembly seeking help because he'd been attacked by a group of brigands in the countryside. They'd slashed him with a knife and he'd ran quickly to the assembly for help. Problem was, he still had his knife attached to his belt, the knife that he'd used to fend off these robbers. So, in order to make sure that his law was followed, he committed suicide there and then. So now let me take you back about 500-600 years BC to a bit of a warrior called Aricion of Phegalia. Now this was a Greek sporting person, and he was taking part in the Olympic finals. How about that? How good must he have been? Well, he was held by an opponent in a stranglehold, and he was unable to free himself during a bout. So he kicked his opponent, causing himself so much pain from a foot injury that the opponent made the sign of defeat to the umpires, and at the same time broke Aricion's neck. Now the problem was, the opponent had already conceded defeat, and then his neck was broken. And because of that, Aricion, who was now dead, was proclaimed the winner, although he was still dead. Now most people who know their history knows that Edmund Ironside, who was King of England in 1016, was sitting on his toilet while some rogue crawled into the toilet pit behind it, stuck a sword up, right up his fundament, and killed him instantly. And there's a few stories like that. The weirdest ones, King Henry I of England died after he ate too many lampreys. It was his favourite food. Now some people say, because lampreys are vampiric, they latch onto a prey and suck their blood. Some say that he ate a lamprey that wasn't quite dead and it attached itself inside his stomach and sucked the blood from him. Others just say he ate too many of them. But he died nonetheless. English kings have a habit, of weird deaths. Edward II of England was said to be murdered after being deposed and put in prison by his own wife, Isabella, and her fancy man, a bloke called Roger. They're always called Roger, aren't they? And he had a horn pushed into his anus, through which a red-hot iron was put in, burning out his internal organs without leaving a mark on his body. Now, there's no proof blimey, what a way to go. Okay, let's have a look at somebody else who's relatively famous. The Duke of Clarence, George Plantagenet. He was said to be executed by drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. It was the wine of his choice, and once he accepted that he had to be killed, that's how he wanted to go. They pushed him in the barrel, he drank as much as he could, they kept topping it up until he was gone altogether. And there's no truth in the rumour that he had to get out 3 times to go to the toilet. Now, I love the sound of this next one. It goes back to 1518, and I bet a lot of you won't have heard of the Dancing Plague. There was a plague, like any great virus or plague, that went through Europe in 1518, and it made people dance for up to 2 and 3 days at a time without stopping. And hundreds of people ended up dying of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, and they all put it down to dancing mania. That was in Alsace and Strasbourg. Now, Thomas Urquhart was a Scottish aristocrat. He also translated a lot of famous people's writings into English, and he was said to have died laughing on hearing that Charles II had taken over the throne. Molière, famous French playwright, he suffered a hemorrhage, a pulmonary hemorrhage, while playing the part of a hypochondriac in his own show. The character ends the show dead in a chair, and he died in a chair. Everybody else thought he was acting until they carried him off, and he was dead. Lots of people in the 19th century have died in peculiar ways. I've got to tell you about John Cummings. He was a circus knife swallower, and on one occasion he swallowed 4 knives quickly and passed 3 of them without any problem. He later swallowed 14 knives and had a little bit of abdominal pain, but he passed all of them. He finally swallowed 20 knives, but he'd only passed 1. He died after 4 years of pain. On his autopsy, they found knife blades in his intestines and 30 to 40 fragments of wood, metal, and horn. That would be a bloody awful way to go. Okay, Archduchess Matilda of Austria set a dress on fire when trying to hide a cigarette from her father, who told her she wasn't allowed to smoke. Odd ways to go. Alan Pinkerton, who was the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency that were catching wild western criminals back in the day, he tripped on the pavement, ending up with him biting his tongue. His tongue became infected with gangrene. He died. Now, how about Empress Elizabeth of Austria? Now, an assassin stabbed Elizabeth with a tiny file, and it pierced a pericardium and also a lung, but because her tight corset held the wound closed, she didn't even realise that she'd been stabbed. She walked for some time before collapsing, and they couldn't save her because they couldn't get the corset off quick enough. Let's face it, for any man that's ever seen or been in a room with a woman wearing a corset, you really can't wait to get it off quick enough. Now, I've always found that with any great religion, you find an awful lot of hypocrites. And this is as hypocritical as it goes. Now, this happened in 1903. A man, an avid Christian, was beaten to death by a fellow Christian who beat him to death with a Bible. A healing ceremony had gone wrong. He was being treated for malaria, and the Christian said he was possessed with demons, and he disagreed. And while he lay there, the more he disagreed, the more the man said the demons were coming out of him, and the more he hit him with the Bible until he was dead. The Christian was a man called Kahuna, and he was brought up on a charge of manslaughter. Now, what about mass deaths? What's the weirdest one? Well, 21 people were killed and 150 injured in the Great Molasses Flood, when a huge tank of molasses burst in Boston's North End and spread down the street at a height of 7 feet, taking people with it and suffocating to death 21 of them. Now, you've all heard of the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb by the Earl of Carnarvon, whose name was George Herbert. Well, he financed Howard Carter's search for the mummy and all of the artifacts, and he died after a mosquito bite. He cut the mosquito bite open while shaving, and it became infected. Other people say it was caused by the curse of the pharaohs for his part in opening the tomb. Isadora Duncan, beautiful actress, one of the early actresses in silent movies, 1927. She was a dancer and she used to love wearing long scarves. She also had a top-down car, a car with no roof, very, very trendy and very, very Hollywood at the time, and she put a long scarf on. While she was driving, the scarf caught in the wheel and choked her to death. Mary Reeser, her body was found by police in 1951, totally cremated. The rest of the room was not burned at all, and to do that to a human body, you would need it 3 to 4 times stronger than any crematorium. She spontaneously combusted. Let's go into the 1960s. A whole batch of army specialists, John Burns, Richard McKinley, and an electrician's mate called Richard Legg, were killed by a water hammer explosion during the maintenance of a nuclear reactor in Idaho. How about Basil Brown? He was a 48-year-old health food fan, and he died from liver damage after consuming 70 million units of vitamin A and 38 litres, 10 gallons of carrot juice over 10 days. When they found the body, he was completely bright yellow. In 1975, Alex Mitchell watched Kung Fu Capers, an episode of the TV programme The Goodies. He laughed continuously for 25 minutes and then fell dead on his settee from heart failure. How about that? How funny must that episode be? Kurt Gödel was an Austrian-American mathematician, and he had a fear of being poisoned, and he refused to eat anything prepared by anybody except his wife. And then his wife became ill, she was hospitalized, and Kurt starved to death. Robert Williams worked at the Ford Motor Company, and he was the first person on planet Earth to be killed by a robot. The factory robot's arm struck him in the head as he walked past, caving in his skull. Now, sometimes in life, you kind of get what you deserve. Dave Grundman, in 1982, went out into the desert near Lake Pleasant in Arizona, and he started shooting at this huge cactus. He fired it with a shotgun 3 times, and then the cactus fell on him, killing him. Also, you know yourself, if you do something bad always happens to you. And I'm telling you about someone that many claimed was a member of the Mafia, a man called Michael Scaglione. In 1982, he was having a bad game of golf, so he picked up his golf club and he smashed it against a golf cart. The head of the club broke off, impaled him in the throat, severed his jugular vein, and he bled to death right there on the hole. Now, Vic Morrow was a star in America. Not a big star, but you would know his face. And he was starring in Twilight Zone, the movie. And he and 2 fellow actors were performing a scene where their characters were pursued by a helicopter. Heat from special effects explosions caused the helicopter to fall on them and 2 of them were decapitated and the 3rd one crushed. Vic Morrow lost his head. Tennessee Williams, a playwright, he choked on the plastic cap of a bottle of barbiturates, and a lot of people said, oh, there were eye drops. No, there weren't. He was a big fan of barbiturates, and he bit the top of the barbiturate bottle like a medicine bottle, swallowed the cap, it blocked his windpipe, he went down. An American actor called Jean-Eric Hexum died after playing a simulated game of Russian roulette with a 4.4 Magnum pistol loaded with blanks. The blanks had paper wadding, and when he pulled the trigger against his temple, the paper wadding was fired with such a force that it smashed his skull, causing massive brain bleeding. At first, people thought there must have been a bullet in it, but there wasn't, just the paper wadding. Franco Brun was an inmate of a detention centre in Canada and said, I am a Christian, I have done no wrong, and I will prove it, for I will eat my Bible. He ate his Bible, tried to swallow a pocket-sized one, in fact. It blocked his windpipe, and he died too. In the 90s, whole batch, Brandon Lee, another actor, martial artist, the son of Bruce Lee, was killed when a badly loaded prop gun fired, and once again, kind of like the wadding, little shards of metal came out and took his life. Now, Gloria Ramirez in 1994 died from kidney failure, and this was related to her suffering cervical cancer. While treating her, a lot of the hospital staff became poorly. They fell unconscious, they were short of breath, they suffered muscle spasms. Shortly before dying, she was covered with an oily sheen that smelled of fruit and garlic, and when drawing her blood with a syringe, nurses noticed it had a smell similar to ammonia, and there were strange particles floating in it that infected the people who looked after her towards the end. Jonathan Capewell died of a heart attack brought on by the buildup of butane and propane in his blood because he used deodorants too much. He was obsessed with personal hygiene, squirted his body, his face, his neck, his armpits about 200 to 300 times a day, and it killed him. John Lewis, a businessman from Minsterworth, tried to light a bonfire with petrol, but he'd spilled a bit on his clothes and he burst into flames. He then ran to the river, jumped in and drowned. Although the incident happened in April the 19th in 1999, he wasn't found for a fortnight until his body popped back up. You can't get enough of this stuff. But let's go into the 21st century, because that's where we are at the present moment. Let's have a look at some of the highlights of the horrible ways to die, or unusual ways to die. And there's millions of them. Millions. But I'm going to pick just one or two. Brittany Cecil died from her injuries at a hockey game when a puck struck her in the left temple. She was the first and only fan in NHL history to die that way. Philip Quinn from Kent was killed when a lava lamp he was heating up on a stove exploded and a shard of it pierced his heart. Kenneth Pinion died from injuries caused by anal sex with a stallion. Nobody ever said whether he was doing the stallion or the stallion was doing him. Woo. Also, Mildred Bowman and Alice Wardle were two sisters. They were killed in Benidorm after being trapped for 4 days when their fold-up bed collapsed with them in it. They screamed for help. Nobody came. Now, somebody that I loved, Steve Irwin, the Australian wildlife expert, he was pierced in the heart by a short-tailed stingray's barb while filming in shallow water on the Great Barrier Reef. We all remember when that happened. It was awful to hear because he was such a nice guy, or so it seemed. And yet, how about Taylor Mitchell? Now, Taylor was a 19-year-old folk singer from Canada and went off into the wilds of Cape Breton Highlands National Park because he wanted to commune with nature while writing some new songs, and he was killed by a pair of coyotes, the only fatal attack on a human being ever. Now, in the 2010s on, Muraka Verncombe was decapitated by a piece of metal pipe flung by a tractor-pulled lawnmower. The lawnmower hit the bit of pipe, fired it at her, took her head off. Mike Edwards was the cellist, one of the main members of the ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. He died when a bale of hay rolled down a hill, hitting the van he was driving, tipping it over and crushing him. Strange and yet awful ways to die. Erica Marshall was a vet in Florida. She died when the horse she was treating kicked the wall, released a spark from a horseshoe, and exploded the oxygen chamber they were both in. Now, when you're in hospital, you like to think that the people treating you actually know what they're doing. Well, how about the case of Hilda Maciel? She died in a Brazilian hospital called Barra-Mansa, south of Rio de Janeiro, because the nursing technicians injected soup into her IV drip into her arm instead of the feeding tube that she needed to be fed by. And you really don't want cock-a-leaky in your veins, do you? Elisa Lam from British Columbia in Canada was missing for a whole batch of weeks before they found her dead in the water tank of the roof of the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. For 3 weeks, guests complained about a weird taste to the water. Takuya Nagaya from Japan began to slither on the floor and claimed that he had been overtaken by a snake spirit. He died after his dad spent the next 2 days head-butting and biting him, trying to drive out the snake spirit that possessed him. A man called Peng Fan was a chef in Foshan in China, and one of the speciality meals, you might have seen this stuff on documentaries, you can eat a live snake and you eat its beating heart, and it all sounds very, very nasty. I've eaten snake, not anything you'd wish for. In this case, Peng Fan was preparing a cobra. It was dead. He chopped its head off. 20 minutes after the cobra's head was severed, it bit him, and he died. Now, Sam Ballard, I have every sympathy for, really. He was 29, and when he was 21, he did a dare. Somebody dared him to eat this huge garden slug that he'd seen. You know, the big, long, slippy, slidey things. So he picked it up, ate the slug, downed it in one, and his friend paid him the dare money. However, 9 years later, he died of angiostrongylolitis. From eating the slug. Some claim that the slug had lived within his body for years. It's just not worth it, is it? Even for a dare or for a laugh. And if ever you do choose to chow on a slug, chow it. Chow it properly. Salvador Disi was decapitated while using a power cart to jumpstart a helicopter. Its slow up and down motion called one of the rotor blades to come down, strike his head, and remove it. Paul McDonald in 2019 was killed by his pet deer in Australia. It butted him for a lark and took his life. Now, here's something that I bet you've used a lot of and never thought twice about it. A drinking straw. Yeah. Elena Gardner of Dorset was carrying a drinking glass with a screw top lid. The screw top lid had a hole in it, and that had a straw on top. The 10-inch straw entered her left eye socket and pierced her brain when she lifted it up quickly to take a drink. Yulia Sharkham, 2019, was leaning through a car window when her 2-year-old daughter activated the window closing button and it strangled her to death. And it doesn't stop. I'm going straight into the 2020s. And why not? Sergio Milan was alone in his apartment in Tarragona in Spain when an explosion in a petrochemical plant 3 kilometers away launched a 1-ton iron plate that burst through his ceiling, hitting him and killing him outright. And already this year, a 54-year-old man from Massachusetts died after eating a bag and a half of black licorice every day for 5 weeks. It caused such low potassium levels that his heart stops. So gan canny if you've got one of those old comfort outfits, you know, the one with the pipe with the sprinkles on the end, and that really hard bit of licorice with a flat end. Just gan canny with the licorice could cause you some harm. Now, I know how keen you guys are about going to visit scary places. So let's move on to the oldest inn in all of England. Now, let's face it, a lot of people claim this, but which one's actually telling the truth? Well, the full story of Robin Hood can be found on robsonsworld.com. The real Robin Hood. We went to Yorkshire, not Nottingham, to find out the true story and walk in his footsteps. That's available for you right now on robsonsworld.com if you fancy a real adventure. Other stories of his tales abound all over the place, and one of them is in Nottingham, even though I think I can conclusively persuade you that the real Robin Hood came from Yorkshire. The oldest inn in England, established in 1199, was built on the site of the Boar's Head Tavern, which was the meeting place supposedly used by Robin Hood, and his merry men. Amazingly, it was directly overlooked by a castle full of men who were searching relentlessly day in, day out to bring any outlaws to justice. Legend tells how Hood was supposed to die in the 1300s at Kirklees Priory. The innkeeper and his family put to the sword, the inn burnt down for harbouring outlaws. Some say that one of Much the Miller's sons exchanged information for his freedom, and this had led to many of the outlaws being apprehended, imprisoned, and executed. A new inn was built there, and as the sizable numbers of soldiers stationed at the castle were waiting to leave England for the Crusades, the name chosen for the oldest inn was Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem. By this time, the chivalrous Saladin was long dead, but the English still believed that the Holy War had to continue, and between 1198 and 1202, they were planning the Fourth Crusade, a direct attack on Egypt. Now, this was later considered far too risky, and they diverted their attentions to take Constantinople instead, which is, of course, better known today as Istanbul in Turkey. Now, the very first ghostly experiences at Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem began to occur as far back as 1214, when King John's men began collecting names for the Magna Carta. They were in a bedchamber when they heard strange noises of festivity. On rousing the innkeeper explained that they were the ghosts of the dead crusaders returning home to England because they chose the last place in England that they could remember, and the last great revelling they did on this earth. Move forward over 400 years, Oliver Cromwell was said to have visited Nottingham in May 1645, arriving in secret to check on how well prepared his men were. He was less than pleased with what he saw, as he had demanded they abstain from drinking and what he described as adverse sexual behaviour until after the campaign. Sex can chill you out a bit. He wanted them all angsty, with a bit of a temper. However, men being men, soldiers being soldiers, most of the inns were full of drinking and bonking. Several captains were demoted and guards were placed on all of the inns to stop any of the soldiers disobeying orders. During the French Revolution, Nottingham became home to many members of the French aristocracy who'd fled from Paris. Many of the locals disliked their French visitors, as they'd always had an uneasy relationship with those across the border, and one French diplomat, known as Charles de Tournai, was murdered beneath the castle walls, set upon by local thugs who were jealous of his wealth and fairly anti-French. The Frenchman managed to stagger to what was described as the Common Inn and collapsed over the bar, blood flowing from him to cover the length of it, forming a pool on the floor. Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem was the only inn there at the time, so we're safe to presume that it was that Common Inn. Visitors to the pub now speak of the ghostly Gaul, often in jest, but the story stuck, only going out of fashion in the mid-1800s. Yet people who visit there today still say they hear people speaking in French accents while they're asleep, or trying to be. More recently, ghosts have been harder to come by, but the building is well worth seeing, particularly a hole in the cellar wall that can still be seen today. Many suggestions have been made as what it was for. The commonest include the medieval equivalent of a wall safe, a hidey hole for lawbreakers, as it was originally covered by a tapestry. Some say it was a stash for armaments for a planned rebellion. But the most gruesome story around it involves a lady called Margaret, a prostitute who lived at the inn in the 1780s. She apparently had an affair with a visiting naval man called Arthur Phillip, who commanded ships transporting some of the first convicts to Australia. On one voyage, Phillip took 570 men and 160 women. His cargo of convicts, including a 9-year-old boy who had stolen an apple from a tree. Of them, 48 had died of smallpox, venereal disease, and influenza during the trip. On Philip's return in 1789, he discovered that the prostitute Margaret had borne a son that she claimed was his. He furiously denied it and instructed a group of his roughest sailors to go to her and the child. Now, whether this meant to pair off or something more menacing, we will never know, because the landlord hid Margaret and her child in the cellar, but she was found by the sailors and taken away. Margaret was never seen again. 8 months later, the landlord drew back the tapestry to find Margaret's baby, gagged to keep it quiet, lying dead in the hole. The innkeeper had presumed that the baby had been taken away with Margaret. Some say Philip put the prostitute on another boat to Australia to hide his shame. But most know she was done away with. Now, let's have another story, another grisly tale for you. And this time, a story of the well-hung Englishman. Throughout history, various rogues have enjoyed notoriety amongst the people, and in Edinburgh, a smuggler called Jock Wilson did exactly that. He smuggled in wine by the barrel, cheeses and silks from Europe. He lived in Gilmore Place off Leven Street, and everybody for miles around knew what he did for an illicit living. No one bothered to do anything about this, for he seemed a nice fellow. He was always giving gifts to people, sharing bottles of wine, giving free cheese to the older folk, and generally bothering no one. Now, The English were in control in Scotland at this time, in the late 1730s, and they were not quite so willing to live and let live. So Wilson was arrested. They found gallons of wine in a shed at his home, and hundreds of cheeses and miles of silk. There wasn't even a trial. He was strung up in the Grassmarket just along from Parliament House, where the English military commander had already decided his fate. And on hearing how this canny Scot had met such an unnecessary death, the people of Edinburgh gathered on Princes Street, and a riot ensued. The commander allowed Captain Porteous to take charge of the situation. Now, Porteous was an uncompromising sort. He ruled his men with an iron glove, and no unruly mob would do him down. Now, the crowd that had gathered were men, women, and children who were all just disgusted at the punishment that Wilson had received for merely selling unregistered goods. He hadn't hurt anybody. Smuggling was commonplace in Scotland at the time, and even the English soldiers used smugglers to provide them with stuff they wanted. The Scots were also unused to restrictions, such as there were south of the border. So this rather pompous man, Porteous, rode up to the crowd astride a grey horse and shouted, "Return to your homes, or I will order my men to fire into you. This is my promise, and you shall get no second warning." The crowd heard. They're Scottish. They're not going to pay any attention to a Sassenach. Although their blood was up, they wanted to do nobody any harm. They just were demanding English justice should not be so heavy-handed in Scotland. The commander even believed that they did have a point, and he agreed that this was a time for diplomacy. So he sent a message to Captain Porteous, saying that he should back down and allow the march peacefully to go through Edinburgh unimpeded. Now, some say Porteous didn't get the message, others that he received it and ignored it. Either way, the crowd moved forward, and he ordered his men to fire a volley from their rifles. Over 30 people were injured, including a girl of 8, and 6 men were killed. The riot was effectively over. Everybody ran to safety. But the commander knew that if he didn't act quickly, there would be a major uprising because of this. He therefore had Captain Porteous arrested and put him in an Edinburgh jail. Now, maybe it was no coincidence that the jail had only one guard, for that night in 1737, a mob of Scots broke into prison, released 4 other prisoners, and seized and took Captain Porteous. They took him into the courtyard, where they used an overhanging beam as a makeshift gallows and winched him up into the air. They say that as he hung there, his legs were kicking in the wind, and men would jump up to hang on his legs so that the noose tightened even more. They then cut down his body and displayed it for all to see, leaving a huge note pinned on the door of the prison. "Justice be done for all." And they say that a ghost walks Cowgate near Parliament House, and it's that of the hanged man. Now, no one's really sure whether it's Jock Wilson or whether it's the loathsome captain, but they can tell you that the head lolls from one side to the other, having been broken on the gallows. Now, I know how keen you are on all things conspiracy related, so I thought I would share another one with you. Have you seen a film starring a man called John Voight called The Odessa Files? In this film, John Voight discovers that even though the Nazis were defeated soundly in World War II for their loathsome practices, there were still plenty people alive and living in Germany and around the world who still believed in it. It was said at the time that evil had been vanquished and never again would the Nazis rise. Well, a lot of Nazis did escape the grasp of the Allies. If you want to find out about Hitler and where he went, because he didn't die in World War II, Walking in the Footsteps of Adolf Hitler is available on robsonsworld.com. Well worth a look. Well, the Third Reich could still be influencing politicians and people across the world, according to people who believe in the Odessa. Halfway through the war, realizing the way that it was going, a lot of Nazis, including Otto Skorzeny, Martin Bormann, Reinhard Gehlen, and many others, started to plan for their own end to the war, to make sure that they survived. And what they did, they formed an organization called the Odessa. It was split into 3 separate organizations. The first part of the organization, run by Skorzeny, they ended up creating a system for smuggling important Nazis from Europe to safe havens across the world. Colombia, Indonesia, even some of them Australia. The second group was Gehlen, who was in the Nazi intelligence during the war. He set up a whole organization of Nazi spies that would base themselves in Munich, and they were known as the Organization, or De Org. And the third group, and they were the ones that really did the dangerous stuff, the transport of money, gold, artwork, anything worth a fortune, stolen from all of Europe, the museums, stately homes, banks. They ruthlessly robbed everything in sight, and they then had to get it out of Europe once Germany had fallen. Now, Skorzeny also did this kind of stuff, but no matter how clever they were, surely none of them could have succeeded without help from outside. And this is where people who believe in the whole Odessa thing, well, it goes into a dark netherworld, like the dark web. But before the web, there were dark organizations that were literally off the map and hidden. And an awful lot of this help, whether we like it or not, seemed to come from the United States of America. Now, we already know that a lot of people working on the nuclear bombs in Germany ended up going to the United States to work in their space program. Also, it could be argued that without the intervention of Nazis, the CIA would never have happened. And there would be no such thing as NASA, because the bulk of scientists working on it originally came from Nazi Germany. Maybe America would never have even made it to the moon. And maybe this Nazi underworld still exists. It never went away. Now, Skorzeny was actually arrested. He was captured by the Allies, and strangely, he didn't face the Nuremberg trials. Everybody expected him to be dragged there, and probably with a firing squad at the end of it. Yet for no particular reason, the Americans released him free of charge in 1947 after he had helped them with something. Now, okay, let's take it a little bit further. There was a group during World War II called the OSS. It was kind of like an underground spy organization known as the Office of Strategic Services. It was created for the Allies so that we had our own spy network against the Nazi threat. Now, the Americans contacted Galen, one of the original Odessa founders, and they ignored the fact that American law, hiring anyone who was a Nazi, was against the law and could lead to imprisonment. Galen, using around $200 million, helped transform his Odessa, the so-called organization of spies, and he used American money to do it. So who was paying him? Who are those people? And he worked alongside a man called Dulles, who became head of the CIA in 1947. And Galen was then in such a senior position that he actually had say over American foreign policy, and to a degree, some of the things that actually happened in the US. There was a project in America called Project Paperclip. Now, this is well known and well documented, and it was America's government trying to sweep up all of the German scientists for essentially the space race, and to increase their capabilities of building weapons of mass destruction. Now, the CIA swept them all up, and even though they weren't allowed to hire Nazis, they were able to hire Germans who weren't Nazis, so that's what they called them, so that they could hire them and not have anything to worry about themselves. Werner von Braun, the man behind those horrible V2 missiles that spattered and landed all over Britain, especially London and Coventry, flattening the place. He was hired to work on the space program. Now, he was a Nazi. Let's not put two ways about it. He was a Nazi. They hired him because they wanted his capability, and they didn't care about his politics, when they should have done. Now, you could argue, is the Odessa anything to do with the New World Order? Well, now, some people, I disagree with this, but some people say that the Nazi regime was the forerunner of the New World Order. Now, problem is, the New World Order hated anything to do with religion, and the Nazi regime was strongly Christian. There were a Christian religious belief behind all of that. Hard to believe, but true. Hitler was out to conquer the world, but when he was unstable and he turned absolutely crazed, and you can, again, walking in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler on Robson's World, it goes into all of the weird, and there's some seriously weird stuff he got into. So the Reich dismantled itself, and some say that the forces behind the Nazi regime transformed itself into the New World Order. There's no proof of it, but a lot of people claim it, so I'm bringing it to your attention. Now, Galen, once he'd been captured by the US, bargained for his freedom, and he gave up microfilm copies of everything that his spies, his whole ring of spies, his Nazi intelligence organization had found out about Russia, and they had a lot of information on them. So the Americans made a deal, and they took his name from the list of Nazi prisoners of war, and Galen walked free too, after he and his colleagues were part of that horror that led to the death of millions of innocent people. But he's given us something that we want, so the Americans set him free. Now, we mentioned that Dulles became head of the CIA. Now, his older brother, John Dulles, was Secretary of State under the administration of Eisenhower at the time, and he became liaison with a chemical company worth billions called IG Farben. Now, a lot of people claim that that whole company only existed because it had been supported by the Nazi Party. They even built a plant of IG Farben at Auschwitz, and I've seen where it stood. Farben was the company that made those horrific Zyklon B crystals that they would drop into all of the huts to wipe out hundreds of Jews all at once. So sometimes you have to look through these things and realise there's an awful lot of odd bedfellows that are all together and all implicated and all partially responsible. If you are responsible for allowing evil to flourish, it's your fault too. Now, you could argue that if you were a German Nazi and you were trying to get the hell out, you didn't have any need of an organisation, you would probably be able to get as much help as you needed if you offered your services to Russia, even Britain, because we did it too, the Americans. Some went to countries that didn't have extradition treaties, and they were able to get there because they had all of that money that they'd stolen from banks and stately homes and churches and museums across the world. There are many, many households in Germany today of ordinary people, and on their walls they have icons stolen from Russian churches, or pots with prehistoric symbols on them stolen from museums across the world, and the soldiers just simply kept quiet about them. So, could there really still be a secret society called the Odessa? Now, Simon Wiesenthal is a man I've been lucky enough to talk to on the radio over the years. He is the most famous of the Nazi hunters. Now, some people claim that the Odessa was a figment of his imagination. He wanted there to be an organisation like that so that people would put money into his organisation. And he claims that he'd tracked down over 1,200 Nazi criminals. Now, his official tally, the ones that he can prove, was about a dozen, and some of them were relatively small players in this. However, others claim that they've got the names of all 1,200. And who knows the truth between those two things, because people can say whatever they choose. Wiesenthal, in my opinion, is a hero. Catching any of them is better than not catching any. We have heard even recently of people like Donald Trump pushing forward with fascist agendas, with white supremacists, with Nazis supporting the Make America Great Again thing and rebelling against the country. We've heard a lot of stories of this, and it's all a grotesque circus. We've had a few people that have gone along to check out the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, and they have found groups of Jewish spies travelling the world, seeking out, finding, and in some cases killing Nazis. And there's many that would say good riddance to them. Yet some of the people mentioned by the Institute, and there was one called Irna Wallisch. She was number 7 on the World War II Nazi most wanted list. She was a guard at the death camp called Ravensbrück. She was brutal and smashed babies' heads against walls, killed any woman that turned her face towards her. She was a vicious and evil woman. It was claimed that not only Wiesenthal, but the authorities across the world had been looking for her hard for year after year after year without success. Yet a journalist looked up her name in the phone book of Vienna in Austria, saw her name, went round, had a chat with her over a cup of coffee. Her name and flat number was in the residence book posted in the reception area of the block of flats where she lived. So that's how hard she was to find. On realising she was in Austria, it took him a look in the phone book and a trip in the car down to where she lived. So when you wonder just how much truth is in all of this, and when you question yourself and say, surely there can't still be an organisation of Nazis called the Odessa, well, then you look on your television screens and see people attacking democratic state capitals and wonder just how many of them didn't just want to make their presence felt or their opinion over an election that they didn't agree with. There was more to it than that. The people that stormed Capitol Hill had already gone there in advance, helped, aided and abetted by politicians from a particular party, most believe the Republicans, and they knew the layout of the building and they knew where the politicians would be, and they planned it to be a darker day than it proved to be due to the swift actions of those behind the scenes getting all of the representatives out of trouble. So when we say, well, surely there can't still be an Odessa, the one thing we can be certain of is there's evil out there waiting to try and take control any opportunity they get. Until we're together again, stay well, take all the necessary precautions. You are a precious thing. We need to look after you. And we'll be back again with more of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. Until then, from me, Alan Robson, God bless you, and I wish you well.